So, greetings, good afternoon, everyone, our president, chancellor, vice chancellor, academicians, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. It's a privilege and honor to be here. 54, 55 countries in Africa. Let's say we have 5 regions, and we have 2 represented here, South and West. So, East, North, and Central Africa, we don't have any representative here. So it's a privilege. And I assure you that deliberations, I will, like I did the last time, I'm going to share them with the Social Science Research Council in Nigeria, where the president is a colleague of mine at the university. And, okay, all right. To start off, I just, prior to this, my idea of disability, or what I know about disability back home, we know exclusion. Pacelli School of the Blind, Deaf and Deaf School, School for Special Needs. Professor Tom Shakespeare mentioned that. How many of us have postgraduate students who are disabled? And I looked, I said, none. The only people we see that went to school with us, people who had polio, and this was due to childhood immunization. And it reminds me, in the hospital, they keep telling mothers, you have to get your children immunized. And also, before I go into my paper, in the northern part of the country, there was a time people were against immunization. They said immunization was a device to reduce their population. So we have a lot of physically disabled people from northern Nigeria. Now, moving on to my paper, I start by telling us about Nigeria. One of the most densely populated countries in Africa. We have over 200 million people. And by the time I discussed this paper last year, I said, 25 million people in Nigeria living with one form of disability or another. But when I went back to check the World Bank report, I found out that 29, and it's estimated that nearly 40% of the people with disabilities in Nigeria, they have multiple impairments. And at least 3 million of these 29 people living with disabilities in Nigeria are said to be severely afflicted and unable to independently function physically or socially. Now, I want the forms and cause of disability. If we look at the forms, we'll say, it's general. But then, what about the causes? You'll find out that some of the causes need not be. Why? Because good. Things like untreated preventable diseases and injuries. Again, good congenital malformations may be globally, but things like physical injuries due to traffic accidents that are not properly treated, outbreak of infectious diseases, unchecked chronic illness, unhealthy environments, inadequate immunization, exposure to childhood preventable diseases, poor maternal and neonatal care, poor trauma care in health facilities that contribute to infection, they increase disabilities, poor nutrition among poor people, result of conflict. Right now, we are still battling with the insurgency in the northern Nigeria, especially the northeast. And that area has the highest number of people with disabilities in the country, especially physical disabilities. Now, what's the government doing about it? Since in our constitution, 1999 constitution, of course, the rights, they conferred definite rights fundamental to the existence of all citizens, including people with disabilities. Also, too, in the country, they've also ratified the CRO PD since 2010. So you can see all these things are in place. And there is a law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities and sanctions those who contravene with fines. All this while, I have never heard of anybody being penalized because they have discriminated against persons living with disabilities, even though it occurs every day. We also have, of course, they set up the National Commission for Persons with Disabilities. That's in line with the Prohibition Act of 2018. And the commission is to prevent discrimination against people with disabilities in the country. And I must mention that we have numerous non-governmental organizations for people with disabilities in the country. And these NGOs were set up by people who have experienced it. They have family members, and as such, they set up these NGOs for awareness and to attend to the cases. But in spite of all these things being put into place, in spite of it all, Nigeria has a positive approach, committing to the key international and domestic instruments towards persons with disabilities. But in spite of it all, a number of people still suffer significant level of discrimination. They are often prevented from participating in their communities in Nigeria. Now, this quotation, the position of persons with disabilities in Nigeria has been described as historically bleak. Because most disabled persons, they lack access to education, healthcare, and employment opportunities that could lift them out of the vicious circle of poverty and disability. The issue is that we can see it as a vicious circle when it comes to the really poor people. So it's been emphasized that how disability is seen or perceived in different cultures and societies will give meaning to how it should be addressed. That is why I want to discuss this case with Nigeria. I remember Anna Martha talked about social and cultural norms. They have a significant impact on what is considered in a society. And also, too, she mentioned that disabled people in wealthy countries, nevertheless, they typically lead they live better lives. I think she was citing Hiller, 2023. They live better lives than some other countries like mine. So I want to discuss from the position of poverty in Nigeria to highlight their peculiar vulnerabilities, and do I call them opportunities or recommendations to alleviate their plight? We've talked a lot about poverty. Poverty. Disabled people in Nigeria are among the poorest of the poorest, and it's further worsened by poverty. It's been estimated that about approximately 9 out of 10 persons with disabilities in Nigeria, they live below the poverty line. Disability can be viewed as both the cause as well as the consequences of poverty. Not to belabor this issue, I discussed with Sabina and Monica, and I asked them, did you look at the household demographic in Nigeria in respect to poverty? Because from my own research in human trafficking, I had to go to the communities and I visited the poorest of the poorest, those people who send their children to go by road through the desert to the Mediterranean to cross over to Europe. And these people have so many children. Why? They believe that children are, gift from God. And they believe that, if the rich man or the rich person, middle class person, they have some wealth, that is their blessing. But their children. So you see so many of them having many children they can't take care of, and sometimes they have to send these children to the city to their relatives, and these children work as house help. So in spite of the poverty, you see them having very large families. So in talking about poverty and disability, I must also mention in my country that persons with disabilities from comfortable homes, they can afford facilities to assist the disabled person. Of course, they can send their children outside the country to get the best education. Oh, yes, they can send their children to Oxford, Cambridge, Yale. And, it's an observed fact that while a disabled person from a well-to-do home can afford facilities like the wheelchair I put in the slide, good education, health care, other opportunities to make life bearable, the disabled person who lives in poverty is more vulnerable. Just a few weeks ago, The House of Representatives summoned Kentucky Fried Chicken at the international airport for discriminating against physically challenged persons. Is this the norm? No. This physically disabled person they discriminated against was, is the son of a former governor of a state in Nigeria. The young man, a wheelchair user, and was denied access in Kentucky Fried Chicken outlet in the international airport. And what's happening now? They have shut down that outlet for just that one person because he comes from a rich family. But then, what about the millions in the rural area that don't have access to anybody to assist them? So, still talking about poverty, poverty, we say, is a major factor that has led to discrimination of persons with disabilities in Nigeria. And like I will say in our local parlance, or we'll say to add insult upon injury or salt upon their wound. There are not well-established governmental social welfare programs cater for these people. We know that. Of course, we know that many developing countries, the government is not supportive of human capital of the peoples with disability. I don't know whether to say they have a narcissistic attitude. The new, I think Professor Sitoli mentioned it. The people in authority. If you read a lot about Nigeria, you will know many of the people in government, they own houses outside the country, and then probably in the world, in banks in Switzerland, they have lots of money. But then what's happening to the common man? So we don't have adequate social protection schemes. So that is one thing that also enforces the issue of poverty. Moving on, cultural and religious beliefs, they have strong effects on the way we view persons with disabilities. So apart from poverty, another major factor that makes persons with disability vulnerable to exclusion is prevalent cultural and religious beliefs. For many Nigerians, traditional beliefs still shape their understanding of disability. And let me explain this. When they see a poor person, a disabled person, for no reason, they can say, oh, it is due to family sin, offense against God, the wizard, adultery. They give a type of interpretation. But what about the rich person? They will say, an enemy has done this to you. Unfortunately for the poor, they are further discriminated against. While the rich are encouraged, what a pity, this has happened to you. It must have been somebody envious of you. So disability is seen, commonly seen as a spiritual sickness and a curse. And our cultural and religious beliefs, taking us back to, like I said, I did a lot of work on modern slavery and irregular migration. And, many of the reasons why our women travel can also be linked to the cultural background. But moving on, labeling and derogatory names are frequently used to describe persons with disabilities according to their perceived sins and offense committed. And this further causes pain and its barrier to and limits persons with disabilities. So, apart from cultural and religious, why do I say religious? Christianity, Islam, kind of we see them as imported religion. Majority, down south, majority of us are Christians, Catholics, Anglican, Protestants, on and on. And in the north, a certain percentage are Muslims. But all the same, we had this traditional belief before we knew Christianity. And sometimes people who say they are Christians, in their needs, they still resort to these traditional belief systems to explain circumstances where they find themselves. Other challenges include people are not penalized for discrimination. All these years, the first case that came up is the case of this young man who is the son of a former governor. Access to justice for non-disabled persons are trampled upon every day. Now, getting to the children. children with disabilities, they still face challenges enrolling in schools. Like I told you at the beginning, I said, oh, we know about Purcell School of the Blind, the Deaf and Deaf School, special needs school. But why are they not included in the normal school? When I was a young child, I had a first cousin who had intellectual disability. To tell you the truth, we didn't know, as children we played, we didn't notice any difference until adults pointed to us, oh, there's something wrong. Children, they don't know. So in fact, like I said, sometimes children of well-to-do and they have some form of disability, when you put them in normal schools, of course their parents will put them in normal schools, some of those very good schools in the country, and the children mix with other children. They don't notice anything. They play with them, push their wheelchair. It's only the adults, the teachers that can make comments. So, but children, especially of the poor, they don't get enrolled in school. So we have a high rate of out-of-school children, disabled, and the poor are the majority. Also, in terms of education, you find out that there are no assisted devices and technology not readily available, and they are unaffordable. The people who can afford them are the rich. In most parts of Nigeria, most parts, persons with disabilities, especially children, who ought to be in school, they are in the streets begging for alms because of neglect. This is an opportunity for the parents, unfortunately, the poor parents, to get some money to feed the family. If you see a child without disability begging and a child with disability begging, you are likely to give the one with a disability. So, oh, okay, all right. Now, before I go into talking about opportunities or recommendation, World Bank Disability Inclusion in assessment of Nigeria revealed that persons with disability in Nigeria, they lack access to basic services, and attitudinal barriers represent a major impediment to their socio-economic inclusion. Like I said, because of cultural and religious beliefs, inclusive policies are said to be non-existent, weak, or inadequately implemented, unfortunately. But then, that is the problem I've talked about. What do we do about it? Reduction of poverty. Implementation of the first SDG goal, number 1, eradication of poverty, specific targets, will be of immense privilege to lessen the plight of persons with disability living in poverty. So, this should be done. Then, amplifying the voice of persons with disabilities. We want to hear their stories. I think people have mentioned it earlier on. It's a means of reducing their vulnerability by empowering, encouraging, and mobilizing them to speak out about their plight on stigmatization, harassment in different communities. But we don't hear about them at all. So this is something that should be done. We want to hear their stories. Then cultural and religious perspective. I said the use of anthropological methods in collaboration with the local communities. For example, when I had to do my research on human trafficking, why are girls going, especially in the area I come from? For the past 40 years, Italy was their main goal. They used to come here, and then people were trying to study, but I went to the different communities, asked, why is this so? I traced that to the law of primogeniture that occurs in my ethnic group, where a man, after his death, everything he owns goes to his firstborn son. And if this is a poor family, he has a poor hut or a farm, it all goes to the first child. This is a family, probably they have 21 children or whatever, so many. Give that example. You may be wondering, how can somebody have a... for example, my own generation, I am the 10th child out of 12. And my husband has 21 brothers and sisters. Oh, with a large family, a man with... I know these things are changing. His father had how many wives? Maybe 4 or 5, with all that, the number of children. But then, my own generation, we trimmed it down to 5 and all. Then, my children's generation, they just said, we just want 2 children, or 1 is enough. But then, back home in the rural area, they said, these children are wealth. Security for the future. So going to the communities, it is good for us to get in touch with them. I usually conduct a lot of ethnographic research. Like I said, I now traced the fact that our young ladies, they like to, because they have nothing to fall back on. So because of that, if anything happens to their father, who is probably their main provider, they are thrown out in the streets, no house, nothing. So we found those girls traveling abroad so that they can have some money and take care of their mother, who probably is not the first wife, thrown out of the house. So in the same way too, there is need to use anthropological methods. Oh, 3 minutes. Let me quickly round up. Need to use anthropological methods in the local communities. Also recommended by World Bank, households, communities, members of religious and traditional and opinion leaders in schools. They should be targeted with measures to reduce stigma associated with disabilities and persons with disabilities based on misconception and negative attitudes. So, incorporating cultural sensitivity into our school curricula, which will help our children to develop an inclusive mindset from an early age. We have other recommendations: promoting awareness and shifting a perception, advocacy campaigns. Also, to religious doctrines to highlight the abilities of persons with disabilities. Positive portrayals in advertisements, TV series, and movies. It can dispel prejudice and promote acceptance. Also, recommend implementation of disability legislation. Program and policy effectiveness can be regularly evaluated to ensure well-informed modifications and advancements. I still stress data collection and research, inclusive employment and livelihood interventions. Also, too, implementation of inclusive urban planning, accessible infrastructure, empowering disability-focused organizations. And I conclude, to address the issues many Nigerians with disabilities face, a comprehensive strategy that takes into account cultural and religious beliefs is needed. Inclusive policies and initiatives can be implemented with the guardians of anthropological insight. Nigeria can advance its transition to a more inclusive and equitable society by raising awareness, fortifying legal frameworks, gathering pertinent data, and empowering organizations that serve people with disabilities. The national and subnational government, they can accomplish this goal by poverty alleviation and economic growth without actively integrating people with disability into their developmental agenda. So no matter how gloomy that story have given at the beginning may seem, with persons with disability in Nigeria, there are some opportunities still remaining, and this can be emphasized and heightened. Thank you very much for listening.